Thank you for joining us for this very special luncheon. So glad that you're able to join us for our conference on assessing the Bush presidency with such brilliant people and very insightful comments that we've had thus far. I also want to welcome our C-SPAN audience, C-SPAN viewers. I'm Gleaves Whitney. I'm director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And this is our first conference. We're teaming up with George Mason University and Mark Rozelle, teaming up here to host our first conference in Washington, D.C. Last night we got a great start at the Library of Congress with Professor Rufus Fears speaking on the Bush presidency in a very long-term perspective of ancient history. And I thought that got things kicked off in a great manner. And we've not been disappointed this morning with our panels. When Mark and I first started talking about this conference, we decided that it would be important certainly to have the best minds in political science to assess the Bush presidency that we could gather in one room. We also wanted to bring in a different perspective, and that's why, for example, we had Professor Fears for a very long-term perspective on leadership and also in American history. We also wanted the perspective of somebody from inside the White House who had spent some portion of his experience there. And as I canvassed the people, and Mark thought about it too, we thought Kasey Pipes would be the ideal person for our luncheon address to give us more insight into what it's like to work for President Bush and give us an assessment of his administration from an insider's point of view. Kasey Pipes is an author and biographer. His first book, Ike's Final Battle, The Road to Little Rock and the Challenge of Equality, came out in February 2007 and became an Amazon.com national bestseller. The Wall Street Journal praised the book as highly readable and a credible account of Eisenhower's struggle with race and civil rights. And George Will called it a mind-opening book. Kasey's political writings have appeared in Politico, Real Clear Politics, and World Magazine, and he's a special contributor to the Dallas Morning News. He's from Fort Worth, Texas, by the way. Previously, Kasey spent 10 years in politics as a communications and policy advisor. In 2006, he served as chief campaign speechwriter to California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, are you the one who came up with that term, hasta la vista, baby?
That's an original line.
An original line, Kasey Pipes. Prior to that, he served President George W. Bush for 5 years. In 1999, he began writing speeches for the Bush for President campaign, and from 2001 to 2003, he wrote speeches in the Bush White House. And in 2004, he was chief author of the National Republican Party platform. So we're sure he also has some interesting ideas about where a lost party should go from here. Well, with that, I'd like to bring Kasey Pipes forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all very much. It's great to be back in Washington and great to be here with so many distinguished political scientists and historians. I want to thank George Mason University for co-sponsoring this, and of course I want to thank my friends at the Hauenstein Center, in particular Gleaves Whitney, whose work I've admired for years, and also Brian Flanagan and Mady Burke for making the conference possible. The Hauenstein Center not only is a premier center for the study of the presidency, but I have very personal feelings about this center because it was so good to me when my Eisenhower book came out, and I was able to do an event with the Hauenstein Center and the Ford Library, which was a great thrill for me, and was hugely important in the promotion of the book, which has now been out 2 years, hard to believe. And speaking of Eisenhower, I can't begin without noting him at the start of this, having spent years researching and writing about him. I think Eisenhower would be somewhat amused by my writing a book about him, and he'd be somewhat amused about me probably being at a conference like this, commenting on a current president. He didn't think much of people who make their living with words. He didn't think much of speechwriters and wordsmiths. He once said to an aide that if speeches were important to leadership, then the American people should elect Hemingway. But nevertheless, I did write about him, and I'm going to talk in a minute about how I think there's some parallels in terms of how the historical revision process worked in Eisenhower's case, and how he looks very different today than he did when he left office. And I suspect, in fact, President Bush may experience something similar to that. So today, we're here to assess the Bush legacy. I thought what it might be most helpful for me to do, since we're assessing it, is to talk about the assessors, the historians, and the battle that will be fought out, the campaign that will be waged the next several years over the Bush presidency, and what will be said about this particular president. You know, Churchill once joked that he was asked how he thought history would regard him, and he said, history would regard him very well because I intend to write it. And presidents often do take a first shot in the battle over their historical legacy with their memoirs, and this president is no different. According to news accounts, President Bush will write a memoir, although interestingly, it will be focused on decision making and the process of looking at very tough choices and trying to find a decision. Many others will write books too, and many others already have. And the decisions and the conclusions that they have to look at and come to will shape this president's legacy for many years to come. What I want to do today is show you what I think some of the Bush defenders will say in that battle for history. Some of the points that they will make in trying to defend the president's record and how that argument is likely to play out. If I were to give a title to this lecture today, it would be a hard presidency, the challenging times and tough choices of George W. Bush. And as you'll see, I think part of the argument that the Bush team will make with the historians in this debate is that they faced an unprecedented set of circumstances and very difficult choices on a whole host of issues. So what I'd like to do for a couple of minutes before I take your questions is sort of walk you through what Bush's legacy looks like today and how it's already beginning to change. Some of the decisions that Bush made and why he did so. And then finally, and really most importantly, how Bush will defend himself before the bar of history. What will he say? What will his defenders say that some of the pundits today are not thinking about? And if I could use a metaphor, I think in today's coverage of the Bush presidency, there's too much of a zoom lens and there's not enough of a wide focus. And I think in the coming years, you're going to see historians begin to step back with the perspective of time and begin to look at everything that was going on in the administration and focus in a wider sense about what was happening. Now, I mentioned Eisenhower, and he provides a good place to start, because when Eisenhower left the Oval Office, surprisingly enough, it was not with a great deal of fanfare. Most people were sort of glad he was leaving. In fact, bipartisan criticism greeted the president's exit with some of the harshest words coming from the right. I love the quote from Russell Kirk, who's known to all of you. He joked at the time to critics on the right who said that Eisenhower was too far to the left. Russell Kirk joked that Eisenhower's not a communist, he's a golfer. With friends like these, Ike didn't need enemies, and his historical record suffered for years. But it began to change. And it began to change in 1967 with the publication of The Underestimated Dwight David Eisenhower, written by Murray Kempton. And then it began to change in a big way in the 1980s with Fred Greenstein, a political scientist at Princeton, known to all of you, who discovered what he termed the hidden hand of the Eisenhower presidency. That in fact the doting grandfather who liked to play golf was all a image creation to essentially disguise the fact that behind the scenes this was a very efficient and effective political manager. As Gary Wills later called him, a political genius. A man who was behind the scenes, intimately involved in very difficult issues. And as my book showed coming out last year, even on the issue of civil rights, an issue that he traditionally has gotten no credit on, I hope that Ike's Final Battle, which was released last year, has helped revise that a little bit. And we see how involved he really was in the issue behind the scenes. So Eisenhower's status today is much different than it was then. And I suspect that, like all presidents, President Bush will get many more reevaluations